Good afternoon. I'd like to introduce you to Louise Shaw from St Masons. Louise is going to do a talk this afternoon on immigration, on preparation for a no-deal Brexit.
So I'm Louise Shaw. I'm a solicitor at the law firm St Masons. I'm an employment and immigration specialist based in Glasgow. I work with employers mainly in infrastructure and retail sectors across the whole of the UK. So I've been asked to join this webinar today to talk about no-deal preparations for people, for employers to prepare on immigration issues that are affecting their workforce due to Brexit. So before I begin, I'll just a quick recap of the news this morning. There's going to be voting later today about 5 p.m. on whether there's an election in December. If there's an election called, then the Brexit bill will continue to progress through Parliament until Parliament's dissolved on the 6th of November. The EU 27 are also meeting, and they have announced that they'll agree to a deadline to the 31st of January next year for Brexit. So you might be thinking, what's the point in preparing for no deal? Well, I would say that I prepared this presentation on Friday morning last week, and I didn't know whether I'd be talking about an exit date on Thursday or not, i.e. 3 days' time. So the political situation is clearly so turbulent and unpredictable that it's essential that businesses take steps to mitigate against the risks of the worst case scenario. It's now looking like we won't crash out on Thursday, but for immigration issues, much of the advice I'm giving does apply also to the Withdrawal Agreement. It's just that there are shorter timescales under a no-deal scenario. And of course, we still don't have a deal, and with an election, everything is still to play for. I'd also say that as the most significant effects of the loss of free movement of EU workers is likely to be felt in 2 or more years' time, don't worry if you haven't done any planning yet, there's still time to start now. So on the slide, I've got the topics that I'm going to cover today. First, I'll just do a brief touch on the terminology I'll be using, and also a bit of myth busting on the effects of no deal on EU citizens. Then I'll cover the timescales under the Withdrawal Agreement and no deal. And then we'll also look at the EU settlement scheme, what will happen to EU nationals who arrive after a no-deal Brexit. And then I'll cover practical actions for employers. And I've got a final slide, which is signposting on further advice, should you need it. So I'll try and keep the legal jargon to a minimum during my presentation, but there are a few words that I'll use, and you may have also heard these in the news recently. The first is free movement. That's the right of EU nationals plus a few other countries to live, work and study in each other's countries, just relying on their passport. This right is also enjoyed by non-EU family members of EU nationals. So for example, if a German person marries an Australian citizen, the Australian citizen also has free movement rights in the UK if the German citizen is here and exercising those rights. The Home Office is the government department that is responsible for UK immigration control and the UK borders. You might also hear it referred to as UKVI, which is UK visas and immigration. I also might refer to EU citizens. Really, I'm talking about EU, EEA and Swiss citizens who can all avail of free movement at the moment. And I've got another slide in a moment showing a map of which countries that covers. And again, if I talk about non-EU family members, really I'm covering anyone with a family relationship to an EU, EEA or Swiss citizen. So which nationalities are we talking about? There's currently 28 countries in the EU, including the UK. Free movement also applies to members of the European Economic Area, or the EEA. That's EU members plus Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. In addition, Swiss nationals enjoy the same rights by a separate treaty. The current government policy is that free movement to the UK would end for citizens of all these countries as a result of the UK exiting from the EU. However, Irish nationals are in a slightly different position. The Common Travel Area allows them to live and work in the UK, and UK nationals have the same rights in Ireland. The Common Travel Area is not related to the EU, and so that won't change on Brexit. And both the UK and Irish governments have confirmed this to be the case. And the rights of Irish citizens is now enshrined in UK law. So I said I'd come on to cover a few myths. There's a few things on the slide that you'll be glad to hear are in fact myths. There's been mixed and at times irresponsible reporting in the media. And there's also been dramatic policy changes from the government in recent weeks and months. So it is clear now that EU nationals won't need to leave on the date of Brexit if there's no deal. They can register under the EU settlement scheme, which I'll come on to describe. And they don't need to apply to that scheme by the date of Brexit. There is a sort of grace period for them to apply. Another key area of confusion has been whether free movement is ending on Brexit. To clarify, there won't be a cliff edge scenario, even in no deal. Free movement is ending as a concept under EU law, but it's now enshrined in UK law until it's repealed. This means that there's going to be transitional provisions even under no deal, which I will come on to explain. And it does mean that the ability of EU migrants to move to the UK and work here is not going to suddenly stop on the date of Brexit. So I said I'd come on to explain the timescales. The citizens' rights section of Theresa May's agreement was agreed fairly early on in the negotiations and was supported by all political parties. Therefore, if a new deal is negotiated, we would expect this situation not to change. And that is actually the case in Boris Johnson's revised version. The citizens' rights section hasn't changed. And so even if we have a general election and a whole new agreement is negotiated by a different political party, I think we are fairly certain that the immigration provisions will stay the same or largely similar. This talk is mainly on no deal preparations, but I've included the slide on timescales under the withdrawal agreement, as I say, because I don't anticipate it would change, and it's helpful to compare the timescales under a no deal scenario. So under the withdrawal agreement, the UK would exit the EU on a given date, but free movement would continue until the end of the transition period on the 31st of December 2020. This means up until the end of 2020, EU nationals are free to come and go from the UK using only their passport. It also means that anyone arriving for the first time between Brexit Day and the 31st of December 2020 would be able to stay and apply under the settlement scheme. They'll have the right to study and work indefinitely. EU nationals who move to the UK from the 1st of January 2021 will be subject to the same immigration rules as anyone from the rest of the world. These rules cater for a variety of options of different visa categories. But the general position is that if the person has no family connections in the UK and is moving here to work, they would need to be sponsored by an employer. And those who arrive by the 31st of December 2020 will have up until the 30th of June 2021 to register for settled status. If there's no deal, then this settled status scheme will still apply, but the timescales will be considerably shorter. So if we move on to the next slide, that's the no deal timeline. The key difference is that if there is no deal, then only EU nationals who are living in the country by Brexit Day will be able to apply under the settlement scheme. The other important thing to note is that EU nationals living here will need to apply by the 31st of December 2020. So that's a full 6 months earlier than under the deal. It will be in their interest to apply as soon as possible anyway, to secure their status and make travel easier after Brexit. And then another key difference under the deal scenario, under the no deal scenario, is that any EU nationals arriving after Brexit for the first time won't be able to apply under the settlement scheme. They'll only have 3 months to live and work in the UK, and then they would need to apply for a new type of visa called European Temporary Leave to Remain, and I will come on to that. In certain circumstances, family arriving after Brexit, where they're joining an EU national who's already here, would be able to arrive and apply for the settlement scheme later. But on the whole, the timescales are considerably shorter under no deal. So moving on to the EU settlement scheme in detail, there are 3 requirements for pre-settled status. And it's much more relaxed than the requirements for permanent residence under the European rules. There are only 3 core criteria that the applicant needs to meet, and these are set out on the slide. The first is identity, applicants will need to prove their identity using their passport, or for EU citizens, they can also use a national identity card. Non-EU family members would also need their UK biometric residence permit if they've got one. The second criteria is eligibility. Applicants simply need to show that they're resident in the UK by the cut-off date. So if you think back to the timescale slides, that's the 31st of December 2020 if there's a deal, or the date of Brexit if there's no deal. I've got the 31st of October 2019 on the slide there for no deal. That was anticipating a no deal scenario happening on Thursday, but it would be the date of Brexit. So at the moment, that's projected to be the 31st of January next year. The final criteria is suitability. The Home Office are going to conduct criminal background checks in the UK and abroad for applicants who are over 18. We expect that the vast majority of EU nationals will pass this requirement. But if an applicant has any criminal convictions, they ought to take specialist advice. Fixed penalties like parking fines and speeding tickets won't cause a problem. If the applicant meets that criteria, then they will be issued with a 5-year pre-settled status visa. And then if the individual has already been continuously resident in the UK for 5 years, as well as meeting those 3 criteria, then they can jump straight to settled status. If an individual obtains pre-settled status, they'll need to move to settled status once they've been in the UK for 5 years. So the key message for me to get across here is that the requirements are really very simple. I've got a lot of experience in other areas of the immigration rules, and the requirements for the EU settlement scheme are much more simple than, for example, the complicated permanent residence applications, which involved an 80-page form and nearly as many documents under the old EU rules. And many EU citizens in the UK might have experience of that application process, and so would naturally be quite nervous about applying under the settlement scheme. It obviously is frustrating for many EU citizens as well that they haven't previously had a requirement to apply, but at least it is a relatively simple process. So moving on to the application process in more detail, I've assisted many clients with applying, and I have also had feedback from companies whose employees have applied that it really is fairly straightforward. It's particularly straightforward for an EU national who's got a biometric passport, who also has a national insurance number. It's a bit more complicated for non-EU family members. And I would caution that we have had a mixed response when using the Home Office's helpline. I've got the number at the end of the pack. It is very helpful that you can phone up and speak to someone and ask questions about the guidance. But on the other hand, we sometimes have had to push them a bit to check with their policy team on certain areas of the guidance for clarification, which they are happy to do if you ask. So the application can be made on a smartphone app. It was until recently only available on an Android phone. It is now also available on iPhone, which is good news for the Apple fans. If the applicant can't upload documents on the app or doesn't have access to a scanner, then doesn't have access to a smartphone, then they can use one of the Home Office's document scanning locations. And I've got the web link for that at the end of the pack as well. There's also the option to post documents to the Home Office. And the Home Office's guidance says that the documents will be returned within 3 working days, which is much, much quicker than many other types of application. You hear stories of the Home Office hanging on to documents for 6 months or more. So at least there is that reassurance that if an applicant doesn't want to use the app, they can post the documents and get them back quite quickly. The government has committed to keeping the documentary requirements of the application process to a minimum, and so far that does seem to be working. What happens is the applicant registers on the app if they're using it and uploads a scan of their documents. Alternatively, they go to the scanning location or they post their document in. And for many applications, this will just be the passport and nothing else. The applicant then also needs to upload a recent digital photo of their face, and then they also plug in their national insurance number, and the Home Office will then access their records from the tax authorities and the Department for Work and Pensions. So for the vast majority of people, and certainly employees who are working in the UK, all they'll need to do is upload this scan of their passport and their national insurance number, and the rest of it will be done for them by the Home Office. It's a bit more complicated where there's gaps in tax records, and that's where the applicant would be prompted to upload scans of additional evidence where that's needed. But there's no requirement to post everything off. It will just be by scan, which makes things quicker and easier. And there are a wide variety of documents accepted for proof of residence, for example, GP records, letters from a school or university, mortgage or tenancy documents, those sorts of things. The applicant is also told whether they are being considered for pre-settled or settled status, and if they're being considered for pre-settled status, then they will have the opportunity to send more documents in to show that they ought to be considered for settled status if they think they can show they've been here for 5 years. Non-EU family members will also need to provide proof of their relationship to the EU citizen, for example, a marriage certificate or birth certificate. Again, these can be scanned and uploaded. They shouldn't need to be posted in. So the applicant should be issued with an email confirming they have applied and an application number. This should come through almost immediately, and for most applications they're being processed within 1 to 4 working days, which is again much quicker than other types of applications under the immigration rules. And if the Home Office needs more documents, they'll tell the applicant by email and give them time to provide these. Once the applicant has received their pre-settled or settled status, they will get a reference number rather than a visa as such. As an employer, you would be able to plug the reference number into the Home Office's website and see the person's status. And the reference will also be linked to the person's passport, which will ease travel through the UK border. It's free to apply, and it's also free to move from pre-settled status to settled status once the migrant hits 5 years in the UK. And some document scanner locations charge a small fee, apparently, but the ones that I've used so far have also been free. So the benefits of the new status is largely that the holder of the status can continue living and working in the UK as they are now after Brexit. I set out the main benefits on the slides. There are specific rules around absence from the UK and breaks in continuity of residence once the person has the status. If they're absent for too long, they might lose their status. So for example, if the person has pre-settled status and they're absent from the UK for 2 years, then they could lose it and they wouldn't be able to move to settled status after 5 years. So I'd recommend specialist legal advice if an EU citizen has concerns about being absent from the UK for lengthy periods, given that the status can be lost. So just to touch on a few other types of immigration status, indefinite leave to remain is a settlement visa. So EU nationals who have indefinite leave to remain in the UK don't need to apply under the settlement scheme, but they can if they wish to. A key advantage of doing so would be that once you have settled status, you can be absent from the UK for up to 5 years and not lose it. Whereas indefinite leave to remain, you can only be absent for 2 years and then you would lose it. Obviously, British citizens don't need to apply, and this includes if the person is a dual national with Britain and another country. Irish citizens, as I've said, don't need to apply due to the common travel area, but they can apply if they wish to, and it might ease family applications if they choose to apply. If a migrant has another type of visa that is not related to free movement, then they would be able to continue to rely on that visa for as long as it is valid. For example, a spousal visa or a dependent visa based on a Tier 2 work visa. Holders of EU permanent residence or a residence card would need to switch because those are old. Those are an old status under the EU rules, so they will need to switch to the new settled status rules. And applying for pre-settled or settled status won't affect the person's nationality of any other country. If there are concerns about the impact of permanent residence in another country, I'd recommend seeking specialist advice in that country locally. So there was quite a lot there. So just to recap on the timescales for the settlement scheme. Free movement will end on Brexit Day, essentially, but there are transitional provisions which I'll come on to talk about. And whereas if there's a deal, then free movement would continue until the 31st of December 2020. And then EU migrants who are here up until that date would have until the 30th of June 2021 to apply. Whereas under no deal, anyone who's here arrives up to Brexit date can stay, but they must apply by the 31st of December 2020, so a full 6 months earlier. Family members can join EU nationals later if there's a new child or the relationship existed prior to Brexit day under no deal, or the 31st of December 2020 under a deal scenario. After that, the new immigration rules will apply from the 1st of January 2021, and that's under no deal or deal scenarios. We don't have much detail on exactly what that will look like yet, but I will come on to talk about what it could look like. So in a no deal scenario, those EU nationals arriving post-Brexit won't benefit from the new settlement scheme. But if they arrive prior to January 2021, then the new immigration rules will also not be in place. So to plug that gap, the government have come up with a new status called European Temporary Leave to Remain. So the way this will work is that there will be 3 months, which is an existing right to enter for EU nationals. So anyone arriving up to the 31st of December 2020 can live and work in the UK visa-free, just relying on their passport for the first 3 months. If they wish to stay beyond 3 months, then they need to apply for European Temporary Leave to Remain. That's a 36-month temporary status. And it's free, and the applicant can just apply once they're in the UK. We don't have much detail on it yet, but I anticipate the process would be very simple, probably modelled on the settlement scheme application process that I've outlined. There'll be no work restrictions, so the person could do low-skilled work if they wish to, and the person needs to have applied by the 31st of December 2020, or they'd need to leave. After the 36 months on that status, it's not extendable, so they'd be subject to the new immigration rules. And for anyone arriving after the 31st of December 2020, the European temporary leave wouldn't be available. They'll be looking at the new immigration system. So the European temporary leave status is really there to plug this gap that no deal would create between Brexit Day and the new rules coming into play. We have less clarity on what will happen with right to work checks in this scenario. The government's current advice is that the checks that employers have already done will still be valid. And at the moment, that means that a check on an applicant's European passport is sufficient. And what the Home Office is saying is that that guidance will change from the 1st of January 2021. And there's also no plans to make employers do checks on current EU employees to see if they have applied for settled status or not. So they've said this applies even in a no-deal scenario, but our view is that this isn't really workable, as there will be a distinction in status between EU nationals who were here before Brexit Day and just haven't yet applied for settlement, and those who are arriving afterwards. They will be eligible for the European Temporary Leave to Remain, which is only temporary. It's not a permanent right like the settlement scheme is. So the Home Office might decide that they can live with this, but it's worth keeping an eye out for any changes in policy prior to December 2020, as the general view among immigration lawyers is that it's not workable, and when the Home Office actually have time to sit and think about it, they're likely to change the guidance, and they tend to do that at quite short notice. In terms of checking current employees and whether they've applied for the settlement scheme, it's helpful to keep track of this, but you can't force them to tell you, as there's currently no legal obligation to check that they have. Obviously, if the guidance changes, then there will be that legal obligation to do so. So this means that for new employees, they can provide their EU passport up to the 31st of December 2020, or they could provide proof that they have applied for pre-settled status, settled status, or European temporary leave to remain. employers can log on into the government website using the details that they would get from the applicant to check their status. It's going to be their name, application number, those sorts of things, and then up comes a screen with the person's photo, and it will explain, it will say what status they have and whether this means they have the right to work or not. So the second half of my talk is really going to cover the practical steps on how employers can prepare for the new rules and prepare for the no deal scenario. So before I come on to that, I thought it's worth taking a step back to consider what no deal and the new rules actually mean. The government has been very clear that EU nationals should be treated the same way as anyone from the rest of the world after the end of the transition period. So even under no deal, there is this temporary leave to remain transition option. But so that means from the 31st of December 2020, then if the person has no family connections to the UK and they want to work here as an EU national, they need to be sponsored for a work visa. So I've set out the basic requirements for that on the slide to give you a flavour of what we'll be dealing with for EU nationals after Brexit. Essentially, an employer needs a sponsorship licence, which they apply for and get from the Home Office. And then to sponsor someone for a work visa, they need to do the resident labour market test. There's a £30,000 salary threshold on the role. The role needs to be skilled to degree level. It costs nearly £5,000 for a 3-year visa. There's a 12-month cooling off period, so you can't have back-to-back visas in this category. And there's also a monthly cap on the number of certificates of sponsorship that the Home Office issue. So this is an outline for the requirements for a new arrival to the UK. There are some exceptions, but the basic point is that it's stringent, bureaucratic, and expensive. In terms of the direction of travel, even if there's no deal, post the 31st of December 2020, then we're looking at some changes to these current requirements. The immigration rules are complex and change regularly depending on the whims of the immigration minister of the day. The Migration Advisory Committee, which is also known as the MAC, has produced a report at the end of last year, which does give us an idea of where things are going. So the good news is that in the context of employers having to also sponsor EU migrants, the MAC have recommended reducing some of the requirements. So that would include lowering the skill level to RQF level 4, which is approximately college diploma level rather than university degree level. They've also recommended removing the resident labour market test, abolishing the cap on certificates of sponsorship, and introducing a 12-month visa for workers of any skill level. So in some ways, sponsoring migrants might get a bit easier, but we will still be left with the need to sponsor far more migrants for work visas in the UK because EU citizens will be included. The salary threshold of £30,000 is also very high, particularly for employers in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and the north of England. There's also high costs. Some of these can be met by the migrant themselves, but a lot of employers cover everything as they want to recruit the best employee. There's also really a minimal low-skilled options. The 12-month visa wouldn't be renewable, which means it's of limited use because by the time an employee has moved to the UK, has been trained, has worked for a few months, then they'll be leaving. So in that context, I'm going to move on to look at some practical steps that you can take in terms of that businesses can take to support their existing staff and also to plan for the changes that are ahead. At the very least, we know what the immigration landscape is likely to look like over the next few years under a deal or no deal, which is not something we can say for all areas of business that are affected by Brexit. So the first thing that I'm advising companies to think about is considering how they can support their existing workforce and make sure that they feel valued and want to stay. So there are some suggestions on the slide. It's basic things like communication. This needs to be clear and concise. Obviously take care over what is just issued to Irish nationals, for example, who don't need to apply, and avoid causing more confusion than there already is. Generally, in our experience, employees have really appreciated supportive guidance from their employer, And we have even got our FAQ document, for example, translated into a number of different EU languages. There are some of the guidance on the government website is in different EU languages, but it's not all of it. And it's complicated language, not something many employees would be used to dealing with in English on a day-to-day basis. So that's worth considering as well. There are some other ideas on the slides. I've got a support request for documents there. As I've said, most employees won't need many extra documents. Some might need a letter from an employer just confirming that they've worked this date to this date in the UK. And they also might need help accessing their pay slips to provide pay information, depending on their type of application that they are making. You can also signpost further support. The government employer toolkit is pretty good. It's got posters that can be displayed around business premises and communications that are aimed directly at staff. So there's a link to that on the final slide. Also consider training HR teams on the EU settlement requirements. HR are likely to be the first port of call for questions coming from employees, so it's good if they're equipped with the ability to either answer the questions or signpost to that further support that I've mentioned. Businesses could also consider offering loans for immigration applications, for example, British citizenship, which some EU employees may be considering rather than the settlement scheme if they've been here a long time and they want to make sure they've got a really solid immigration status, and allow time off for immigration appointments. As I've said, not most EU citizens wouldn't need to attend an appointment, but non-EU family members most likely would. Also consider what practical support you can offer with the process of applying. Not everyone has a smartphone, so I've literally had clients who've had an HR person sat in an office with a smartphone that people can bring their passport in and actually use to make the application. They start off the application on that smartphone, and then they can complete the rest of it online on their own device in their own time. We've also found that a lot of the issues with that actual application have been from not knowing how to use the app properly. It's sort of like how you'd scan a QR code, you scan the biometric chip in the passport. So if there's an HR person sat in an office who's worked out how to do that, then they can assist other employees with doing it. Generally, it works on the second or third try, and the app also is quite glitchy, I should mention, so it does sometimes crash, so the message is just try again. If it does crash, it tends to work on the second or third time. So looking ahead, there is quite a lot that businesses can do at the moment in a deal or no deal scenario. There's a window of opportunity here up to the 31st of December 2020. The settlement scheme, as I've explained, is much easier to apply for, and the eligibility requirements are simple. So even if there's no deal, employers have an opportunity to bring in EU nationals before the date of Brexit. And after Brexit Day, employers can then utilise European temporary leave to remain for up to 36 months. It's free and it doesn't require employer sponsorship and all those tricky things like the resident labour market test, and there's no skill threshold or anything like that. So it's much, much easier than the sponsorship system. So there is that window of opportunity to use if you plan recruitment early. Employers should also be looking at whether they've got a sponsor licence and if they've got access to it. I'm saying to businesses that if they don't have one, they should consider applying for one sooner rather than later. It takes time to get it in place, and so it wouldn't be ideal to try to do that once a business has a migrant that they desperately want to employ. Although we are expecting the immigration rules to change from January 2021, the basic assumption is that the sponsor licence system will still be in place, and that so anyone who's got one already would be able to continue to use it. It's just the parameters of that are likely to flex a bit. So also consider, do the relevant people in your business know how to use the sponsor licence? Usually that would be the HR or recruitment team, and perhaps do a health check of your compliance records. You might know that the Home Office have very strict record keeping requirements, So it's worth taking stock of the current state of your licence. Also consider an audit of your workforce and look at where the impact will most be felt of the loss of free movement of EU citizens. Is it going to be the high skilled areas of your business or the low skilled areas? And if it's the high skilled areas, then it's perhaps less of an issue because you're likely to be able to sponsor EU citizens in those areas, but it's going to cost more and take longer. Which is where the sponsorship system comes into play. If it's the low skilled areas, that's potentially more of a problem, and you will need to look at how you're going to strategize to mitigate against that issue. As I've mentioned, the current proposal is just a 12-month visa that's not renewable, and so it's a revolving door of low skilled EU labour. So it's not actually of much use to businesses. So that's what to look at for UK operations. It's also worth considering, is your business going to be affected by having EU employees who need to travel to the UK for work from other locations in Europe? And do you have British employees working in EU member states? They tend to be forgotten about in all the drama going on at home, but can you offer them similar support to what you might offer EU employees in the UK? We expect that the provision for EU nationals in the UK will be reciprocated by the EU, but under the no deal scenario, there is scope for this to vary state by state. It won't be a uniform approach from the whole of the EU 27. So some member states might take a harsher line than others on this, and some have already promised that UK nationals would be able to stay, for example, Denmark, but others haven't, and there's no guarantee. So potentially British employees in the EU are actually in a more precarious situation and perhaps need more support. I mentioned right to work. It would be a good time to take stock of your right to work records if you're doing an impact assessment on Brexit anyway. Also look at your right to work policies and procedures and whether they are going to need updating. If your records are in good shape, then that's the best place to start for conducting a Brexit impact audit on your workforce. If you don't hold complete records, then that's a wider compliance issue that should be addressed at the same time. You could also look at feeding into the MAC consultations. The government does tend to follow these recommendations. There's a link on the slide there for the current consultation on the salary thresholds for sponsorship. It's important to have your say. As I've explained, businesses are likely to need to rely on the sponsorship system more in the future, so it does need to be a workable system. And finally, consider training your HR or recruitment staff on the Tier 2 work route and other visa routes. Bear in mind that Tier 2 is not always the best option. For example, an employee might qualify for Tier 5 youth mobility or an ancestry visa, which allows them to work but doesn't require employer sponsorship, so generally reduces the bureaucracy on businesses. So in summary, even though it looks like there isn't now going to be a no deal scenario on the 31st of October, there's still plenty of preparation that you can do and should be doing, as there is still the possibility of a no deal situation. And also the no deal is really the worst case scenario. Everything I'm advising actually will be useful and even necessary in a deal situation. The EU settlement scheme is relatively straightforward, but employees will still appreciate supportive communications, and some may need additional support, as I've explained. And particularly in no deal, the impact on the workforce is likely to be felt in the years to come rather than immediately, because we will have these provisions that will mean that the migration of EU nationals will taper off gradually. So it's really important to plan recruitment and expect to rely on the sponsorship system more in the future. And to that end, keep an eye out for the updates on the changes to the immigration system from January 2021, and also before then, updates to the right to work guidance. As I've said, that is quite possible, even though it's been promised it's not going to change. Things can shift at very short notice, as we're learning. So just finally, I have some further sources of advice on the slides there. which are useful links if you do need more support in this area. And I think we've got time for questions.
Well, thank you, Louise. I think that was really, really helpful, actually. There's a couple of questions that came in, or a couple of statements, at least, people put comments. And I think one of them was just that as you mentioned, there does seem to be a bit more of a longer time frame than you said has been reported on the media, which is obviously beneficial, because there's probably a lot of panic in terms of things changing immediately. So that was just a statement that a comment that somebody had put on.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that, definitely.
Another comment that came from one of our webinar attendees was about the time frame for gaining settled status. They mentioned in their own, someone that they know, a friend in the Netherlands, it took 2.5 months to gain settled status. But obviously, I don't know the ins and outs of that particular case.
Yes, so I mean, as I said, I think the straightforward applications where it's an EU national with a biometric passport and a national insurance number, that's where it's going to take, a week, 10 days sort of situation. There are a proportion of people where it will take quite a bit longer than that, and that's usually where there's more documents. There's also perhaps a feeling that the Home Office tend to make a too difficult pile and they deal with the easy ones quickly, and so then that also keeps their statistics up, because they can say 90% of applications have been processed. So yeah, that's worth bearing in mind, and factoring that into any travel plans and that sort of thing.
You mentioned about EU member states allowing reciprocal agreements for workers, for UK workers in EU countries.
Yeah.
Do you know, is it the date of Brexit that we'll know which states that is and what their plans are?
Yeah,
or?
I mean, the difficulty is that you're dealing with 27 different countries and 27 different governments. There is quite a useful, on gov.uk, there's a useful directory of all the countries in the world for travel to those countries. And so you can look up the EU ones, and it does give the most up-to-date situation. So that's, for example, I was saying, I know that Denmark have put in place already an application scheme that's on the government website, and it's sort of alphabetized, and that also gives links to each country's equivalent of the Home Office website. So that's the best place to look.
Someone had mentioned this is specifically about the construction sector, and it's just about the future forecast for EU workers in the construction sector, because it's quite a high percentage in construction that are from the EU.
Absolutely.
It's just more of how you think that will work. What does it mean for the construction sector, if you knew of that at all? Yeah,
I mean, I think what I was sort of mentioning all does apply to the construction sector. Probably is going to impact the construction sector on both ends of the spectrum, the highly skilled and also the lower skilled. The real impact will be felt, I think, in the lower skilled areas, because at the moment there's really very little provision for those types of roles, and very little provision for visas, which is why it's really important to communicate with existing staff and keep them as best you can, and also focus on recruitment and how you're going to deal with that over the next 2 years. There doesn't seem to be much appetite from the government at the moment to have sectoral variations. The only place they've really talked about that is they're trialling at the moment a seasonal migration visa for the agriculture sector. But there's very little appetite for that in other sectors. So that's worth bearing in mind. I think sometimes it's assumed, oh well, we need houses to be built, they'll sort something out. There's very little appetite for that at the moment, and so if you do see the opportunity to contribute to the MAC consultations, then I would do that and jump up and down about the impact this is going to have on the construction sector.
Certainly relevant for the members of the AIF and the High Association Europe anyway. Finally, you mentioned about the right to work checks by the Home Office, and it's not a necessity for employers to check their current employee's status. I just wondered what your opinion was on that, because is it not partly their responsibility to check the status of employees?
Yes, so what I mean by that is if you've already done the checks, it's you've got the statutory excuse against illegal working, and the fact of the matter is that the EU person isn't sort of becoming illegal. You know, they've got their EU passport up until the cut-off date for registering. They don't have to have registered, so actually there's no concern on the employer's part that they're now working illegally.
Okay.
But the difficulty is, how do you distinguish between EU migrants who are entitled to register on the settlement and haven't yet, as opposed to new arrivals into the UK? And that's where I'm saying I think at the moment the guidance doesn't work, and it's quite possible that it will change before January 2021, which is, at the moment, that's when they're saying it will change, but I think it might change earlier than that. And it does tend to change at very short notice, so keep an eye out for that one.
Okay. I think that is all the questions that you've got so far. So I'll just finish up by saying to Louise Shaw at Pinsent Masons, thank you very much for joining us today. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. That was very interesting. At this moment, there doesn't seem to be any questions from our panellists or our attendees. Thank you again.